Louisiana. He had originally turned down the idea, but this now gave him an opportunity to do it. So he's going to recruit the 1st Louisiana Native Guards. There's so many that want to join the Army. The 2nd, the 3rd, they will have the 4th and the 5th and so on. The 1st Louisiana Engineers also come into service. This happens throughout the United States in early 1862 and then picks up speed. I know I want to transfer it over to you in a minute, but there will eventually be 180,000 U.S. colored troops fighting for the United States. Not only is the United States moving south into the South, but the United States Army is also moving up from the South. The 19th Corps, for example, which has a whole lot of U.S. colored troops, is moving out from New Orleans and pushing up the Mississippi River and the Red River, and eventually will fight into Mobile, Alabama, and Florida. In 1862, however, there's only a handful of regiments. One in Kansas, you have a few recruited in Massachusetts, the 54th and the 55th, you've all seen the movie Glory. It's a South Carolina. And then you have the Louisiana Native, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Louisiana Native Guard in New Orleans. When Abraham Lincoln gives his Emancipation Proclamation, and it goes into effect January 1st, 1863, it opens the door for mass enlistments of U.S. colored troops. By the spring of 1863, the Bureau of U.S. colored troops will be established to create a uniform organization, because each corps labeled their U.S. colored troops by different designations. Grant out of Vicksburg will label his African descent. Banks in Louisiana, southern Louisiana, he'll name his Corps d'Afrique. Then you have the Kansas and Massachusetts retains theirs. So there was confusion in numbers. So the Bureau of Colored Troops is going to redesignate a whole bunch of these regiments and label them as so-and-so regiment, U.S. colored troops. By the end of the war, they'll represent a good portion of the United States Army. There'll be more U.S. colored troops in the American service than there are Confederates in the Confederate Army. The United States colored troops will fight in major battles throughout the war. This event represents 1863. We'd like to concentrate on the achievements that they made in 1863. I mentioned some of the Louisiana regiments. In 1863, they'll be fighting in the Siege of Port Hudson, and they'll become very famous. You also have Louisiana units and Mississippi units fighting in Milliken's Bend, which becomes such a bloodbath that using their muskets as clubs, they engage the onslaught of Confederates. And I believe you're going to go next to talk about another important 1863 engagement.
Yes, so pretty much I will be telling you a short little history about the Combahee Raid of 1863. On June 1st of 1863, 3 U.S. naval ships carrying men from the 2nd South Carolina Colored Infantry, led by Colonel James Montgomery, an Ohio-born abolitionist, and a formerly enslaved woman, and now by this point, an abolitionist herself, spy, and scout for the Union Army. That is, of course, ladies and gentlemen, Harriet Tubman. They prepared to land troops along the Combahee River in the next day raid of the Low Country region of South Carolina, which would become known as the Raid on the Combahee Ferry. The next day, on June 2nd, men of the 2nd South Carolina began the raid with the objective of removing and destroying Confederate rivers, supplies, and plantations, and also to free and encourage black male slaves to fight in the Union Army. During the raid, most slaves around the Combahee saw and heard what was going on, and decided to use the raid as an advantage to run from their slavery and get to the Union boats for freedom. It later turned out that after the raid, both Union and Southern sources, that about 700 formerly enslaved men, women, and children had escaped. with about a few hundred later joining the Union Army, including into the 2nd South Carolina Infantry. And it is this example that once again proved, which we will state continuously throughout this presentation, that regardless of race, color of skin, and where they came from, that black soldiers during both, not just in the Civil War, but throughout U.S. military history, that they were capable of fighting just as good as white men did. Thank you.
So a good number of men that enlisted were former slaves. Some were free, some were had escaped bondage and fled the plantations and joined the Union Army. A lot of them were recruited out of contraband, what was called contraband camps, and I believe you're going to speak.
Oh yeah, I'll talk. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
No. Oh, yeah. Thanks, Lenny. Yeah, all right. Got jokers in the back behind me. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to our presentation about the USCT today. As the lieutenant said, we're going to be talking about 1863, but I'm going to buck the trend a little bit here and start a little bit earlier because I'd like to give you a bit of an understanding about what the USCT is. As we said, it is the United States Colored Troops, and they would come about in 1863, but the history of the USCT actually begins much earlier. We can actually trace units of African Americans bearing arms probably around the 1840s or so with African American militias. These did exist all throughout the North and also in parts of the South, as well as mentioning the Louisiana Native Guard, which had existed prior to the American Civil War, and they had been around as well. Now, of course, the idea of African Americans bearing arms at that time was incredibly controversial, and in fact, it was illegal. But of course, that did not stop African Americans from protecting their communities from slave catchers and other individuals who would go about their way to try and bring people back into slavery. Now, we have numerous accounts of individuals in local communities also defending themselves from these individuals. And of course, out of these militia regiments, they would eventually form into the United States Colored Troops that would come about in 1862 and then eventually formally into 1863. Now, one of these units I'd like to talk about is the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, who were brought about in 1862. These were a combination of individuals who were formerly enslaved, individuals who had run away, freemen, etc. And they had made their way to a place known as Island Mound in Kansas. It was there that they say that they fought a number of Confederate bushwhackers. Now, the battle itself ended up being incredibly fierce. Their white officer was shot, presumed to be dead, but he did end up surviving. But when the men engaged the Confederates, it ended up being a hand-to-hand combat and a very bloody affair. At the end of the battle, it was reported that the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry had stood their ground, and it was also seen as one of the first times that African Americans had seen the test of battle. After that, it was made pretty and effectively clear that African Americans, were able to fight and could carry the fight, and they would do so moving forward, after 1863 and then moving on into 1865. With that being said, do we have any questions? No? Yes.
Were the black units seen as less valuable and sent to do the dirty work or the more dangerous jobs?
Great question. I'm going to repeat that for everyone. What this individual asked was, were black units essentially sent out to do the dirty work or work that was seen to be less desirable? The answer to that question is yes. It absolutely was. When African American soldiers were first brought into the Army, they were first used as a service detail. So they were meant to go out and dig trenches, take care of latrines, a lot of manual labor, because the U.S. Army viewed those individuals not necessarily as human beings, but as enslaved individuals. Now, of course, that would change, because when we want to recruit all of these men came to fight. They didn't come to dig. They came to go to the South, do that business, and liberate their former comrades, family members, and arms. And of course, they would have that chance to do so. But in the beginning, it wasn't necessarily that way. Units had to be brought in to do it. Gentlemen, do you have anything to add to that?
Once the fighting started, were they sent into the more dangerous battles?
Into the more dangerous battles?
In the beginning, yes, but over time seeing how black American soldiers proved in combat as just as being as good, it began to change. The perspective of white soldiers thought in the beginning, oh no, it's the USCT. What are they going to do? And then later in the war, it changed to, oh thank goodness, it's the USCT. These men will stay and fight.
The respect for U.S. colored troops, I think one example that exemplifies this is Colonel Payne will become a General Payne. When he was writing his wife home, if you look at his letters, in the 4 years he was writing, his first group of letters refers to them as inward troops with the hard R. Then he uses the word Negro, and then he uses the word colored. And by 1865, it's men. These are men.
Right.
You can see the progression in just that one man's letter.
Yes.
Early on in the war, did any black soldiers fight or were forced to fight on the Confederate side?
So this is kind of a tricky question because it brings into account the idea of African American Confederate soldiers. To properly answer that question, I will say yes, some men might have been forced to fight, but they were not soldiers. We do know that there were accounts of what Union soldiers called snipers or pickets. Generally speaking, it might have been an enslaved person who was given a rifle, put in a tree, and then supposed to pick off these, Union soldiers. But they did so out of the fear of their lives. I mean, these men weren't soldiers. They weren't free. They weren't paid. They weren't even really given a uniform. So for me, as someone who does reenactment and living history, I wouldn't call those men soldiers.
It's also important to acknowledge that many of these camp servants, slaves that were part of the Confederate Army, who were accompanying their masters. Some of them actually, for example, in 1863 during the Gettysburg campaign, there are actually even reports of former slaves actually when the Confederates were marching into Pennsylvania. They literally used that advantage of running away. It was trying to gain their support to make them feel like, well, this slave is being nice to me. But as soon as they got to the north, they ran as fast as they could. And unfortunately, during the Gettysburg campaign, there is reports that the Confederates, they were even taking three people of color and reinstated them into slavery. It was also it's kind of an aspect of the Gettysburg campaign that not many people, that's not exactly expressed. Any more questions?
Yeah, I think you have a question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Did your 97th, did they get equal pay when they first joined, or did they have to fight for equal pay like the 54th?
The question was about pay.
Equal pay.
Yeah.
The 97 equal pay.
So U.S. colored troops, when they removed the word white and citizen out of the Militia Act,
Okay.
but the military, their books still had for the payroll, still had them at $7.
Oh, okay.
And because the only time you find the word African as a soldier is an African cook, and so they're paid $7. So that could only be adjusted by going through acts of Congress.
Okay.
So U.S. colored troops, of course, were absolutely angered by that. It's to the front. They wanted to change. Officers, they had to go through a vetting process to become officers of U.S. colored troops. They had to say, yeah, we need to be on their side. So they sent letters home, and they pressured up the chain of command and had to persuade politicians to change that. As the war progressed, the pay was equal. Back pay was given. Pay is an interesting thing. And we think of getting paid every single month or bi-weekly. Soldiers were only paid when they returned back to their headquarters camp. So they were on campaign for months at a time. They're going months without a paycheck.
It's also important to understand that back then, money, for example, $13, which is the standard pay, that was almost $100 back then.
Seems you had a question.
I think you just answered it. So my question was going to be what most white troops were being paid.
Okay.
13.
Yeah.
It should be addressed, though, the famous 30 acres and a mule concept was not honored at the end of the American Civil War. So in fact, even if you come to our camp where the 97th is stationed, it talks about either being paid a set sum of money or you'd be given a set bit of land. None of that was given to any USCT soldiers at the end of the war. All of that was rescinded. Part of that has to do with the fact that the American government made a very specific choice at the end of the war to try and reconcile the differences between the North and the South. Unfortunately, well, it was at the cost of African Americans, and specifically African American soldiers who had fought and died in the war and should have been given, the things that they were promised. But it was seen to be more important to be able to bring in the former slave owners and to ensure that, they were treated well and that they had what they needed, so that way there could be sort of this unifying, sort of happy moment at the end of the war. In particular, if you did not know, former slave owners were actually paid for the slaves that were free. So if you think about that for a minute, it seems kind of crazy. You can own all of these people, you can betray America, you can secede, you can kill other Americans, and then the US government goes out of its way to pay you for doing all of that. Frankly, it seems kind of insane, but unfortunately, that is the way that the history went.
You mentioned pay, and I overlooked mentioning bounties, because the men that were in the USCT service, some of them enlisted, some of them were drafted, because at the same time they're allowing US colored troops, they introduced the draft. You have enlistment, drafted, some were paid a $100 bounty, some were paid a $300 bounty, depending upon when and where they enlisted. And some US colored troops, when they enlisted, their enlistment was counted in other states to meet their recruitment totals.
Excellent.
So is the bounty the same as a surrogate, or the surrogate was just an individual transaction with another person who was drafted?
I don't know the relationship between the two. I do know that there were two different bounties paid, and some men didn't get a bounty at all.
What exactly are the bounties?
A bounty is, hey, if you sign the papers today and join the Army, we'll give you $100. But what that really meant was, we're going to give you $33 now, and then a year later, we might give you $33. When you go through the service records of the individual soldiers, you'll see still do their bounty payment, month after month after month after month. And even after the war was over, widows and so on and so forth and former soldiers were still, these veterans were still saying, where's the remainder of my bounty?
This is a kind of post-Civil War, but there were a bunch of veterans reunions in 1888, 1913, and then 1938. And I was always wondering, why were the African American veterans you never see them in the footage or at the events?
Oh, for the...
Yes, the veterans reunions. That's something that I was very curious
So
about.
this question was about veterans reunions after the war, and why don't we normally see African American veterans at the veterans reunions? There's no easy way of saying it. Most of it really just has to do with racism. Segregation existed at the time, and so bringing African Americans into predominantly white spaces was not seen as appropriate.
It's also important to point out that around this time, for around 1910, 1920s, and 1930s, was also the height of Jim Crow.
Okay.
Right. And then especially considering the fact that this was also, and I know this may also be another controversial part, was also when Confederate monuments began to massively grow around that time. It seemed almost very suspicious how these monuments that are supposed to represent the pride of the South, but at the same time, it was also enforcing hard racist laws against Black Americans.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
All right, thank you.